So Jay, good morning. I'll let you get things started, but I'll just make the comment at this point that the meeting is being recorded. The video, audio is being recorded, and we'll have that posted on the CARSI website within the week. Within the next day or two, within this week.
All right. Well, welcome. This is, I'm looking forward to this first meeting of Workforce and Distribution Subcommittee Work Group. The script to open the meeting, this meeting is being recorded and posted on the Commission website. Before we begin, we'll take a roll call. If there's anyone else present in the room with you during the meeting, let us know. Before we begin, we'll take a roll call. I'm sorry I said that. Also, please note that there will not be a period of public comment during the meeting. So you may visit the website for the Commission hosted by the CARSI School and provide comment using the link provided. You can also send an email to schoolfunding.commission@unh.edu. Also, visit the Commission website to learn about public engagement opportunities during the study. Further questions can be directed to the chairman. I think that would be David Luno, Representative Luno. Okay, with that, have I passed my first test?
Got to call the roll.
Got to do a roll call.
Yes, here we go. Bruce, have you got that in front of you?
You want me to do it?
Yeah, it's sure.
Sure. Senator Khan, Jay Khan.
Here, nobody
Bill.
present.
Thank you. Bill Ardinger.
Here, nobody present in Concord.
Thank you. Val Zanchuk.
Here, nobody present.
Barbara Tremblay.
Here, nobody present.
Jane Bergeron-Bilou.
Here in Litchfield, nobody present.
And Iris Estabrook is not here right now. That constitutes the members of the work group. We have additional commission members joining us as well. But I can see Chris Dwyer.
Yes, here, nobody present. I'm just planning to listen.
Thank you.
Hi.
Dick Ames.
I'm here, nobody present.
Thank you, Dick. And I see Iris has joined us.
Hi, I finally got on. I'm here with my husband in the other room, door closed. He's otherwise engaged.
Hi, Iris.
Also here for at least a while is Jordan Hensley, CARSI staff, and Bruce Mallory here. I have my spouse is in another room right now, trying to get her to not talk quite so loud on her phone call. So we're off and running.
And Rick and I are both here.
Yeah,
Sorry.
and I'm here with nobody present.
And I'm here and just Ozzy, the long-haired dachshund.
All right, we are all accounted for then. Thank you. Want to begin our conversation today with a review of our task list. And hopefully, in light of the conversation that we had about the task list at the full commission discussion, arrive at an updated description of those tasks. So I sent that around. Bruce started something last night, and I thank you, Bruce, for preparing the agenda and getting this stuff to us. It occurred to me when I looked at it that maybe I wanted to adjust that a little bit beyond what I was able to convey to Bruce. So you should have in front of you a list of 5 tasks. And 4 of those should look familiar to you. In looking at the charge, task number 4 has been added to ensure a uniform and equitable design for the cost of an adequate education. The word financing there, while it comes from our charge, is I left it there with a strike through so that it was clear that is part of the charge is for the financing of the cost of an adequate education. But as we talked at the commission meeting, it seems most appropriate for this committee to work towards the cost of that adequate education and to leave for the financing work group that question on financing. So with that, let's open the conversation on these tasks. And ultimately, where we're going to drive with this conversation towards the end of this meeting is, and so what's going to be the timeline that we need to set so we can structure some tasks along the way here and try to do so in a manner that's going to lead to conclusion in 4 months. Okay, open for discussion.
Jay.
I see Bill.
Yes, thanks. What I wanted to start with is you guys have heard about my kind of general goal as one member of the commission is to focus on distributing precious state revenues and funds in a way that focuses on lesser resourced communities first, and thereby reduces disparities in educational opportunities and educational outcomes, or at least is intended to do that. I wanted to start out with, I think that these tasks are, the task lists are very good. And Bruce, Jay has added a task in something that he just talked about. The one you've got up on the screen is the prior one. And so
Right.
it doesn't have that task that Jay just talked about. And I think that's really important what Jay has added, the call.
So, excuse me, Jay, I don't know if you sent me a revised version of this after
Yeah.
last night.
Yeah, I did this morning, but
It's okay. You
but-
might want to just take it down right now, Bruce, while we're just chatting.
Yeah, I'll do that. Although, Jay, can you resend that to me? Because I do not have anything from you for this morning. It may just not have gotten to me for
Sure.
some reason.
But, you know what I can just say to you, Bruce, is you're not discombobulated. What it was from. It took the which is to and separated out the ensure.
Fine, okay.
That became a separate task.
Yeah.
So my point is, I am very focused on separating out and making a distinction between the legislature's taxing power, which Claremont addressed, and the legislature's appropriation power, which the Claremont cases did not address. So as we know, what the Claremont holding said is that when you're raising money statewide for adequacy, you need to do it by a tax system that has a proportionate rate, a reasonable and proportionate rate throughout the taxing district. That's the taxing power. That is not the appropriation power. It said that when you're raising that money for what is determined to be an adequacy amount, which is in the aggregate, you need to use statewide taxes. It definitely does not say that once the state has raised these revenues and collected them under a state tax system with a proportional rate, that the legislature is constrained in its appropriation power to spend money in a way that is rigidly focused on getting money throughout the state, regardless of the resources of individual school districts. In fact, you can look at on Jordan's, what he sent around, Jordan's last quote is so important. We emphasize that the fundamental right at issue is the right to a state-funded, constitutionally adequate education. It is not the right to horizontal resource replication from school to school and district to district. At the end of that quote, but when an individual school or school district offers something less than educational adequacy, the governmental action or lack of action that is the root cause will be examined by strict scrutiny. So my initial pitch, and I wanted to get it on the floor right away because I think it definitely has been something that has tied hands. I'm so glad Iris is going to speak. I want to hear Rick, who has done this before in other settings in the legislature. I believe that the Claremont case, as called, was started for the benefit of the plaintiff communities, which were lesser resource communities. And if the state ends up with some weird legal construction of the Claremont case that says, you know who won? Not those communities, but rather who won was every school district, even those that have great resources. That would be an absolute travesty to the plaintiffs in that community. And why have we gotten down this path? I think we've gotten down this path not because the court required it, but because there are political interests other than public education that are trying to say that the only way the legislature can distribute these state adequacy monies is in a per pupil basis in every community. The court did not focus on the appropriation power. And I think it's what troubles me so much is when I make the statement in other settings, people will say, well, Bill, we agree with the principle that the money should be focused on those communities who have the greatest need to help those children who have the greatest need. But we can't do that because the court said we couldn't. I am saying to you all, if we develop an appropriate formula, a la something like Massachusetts, which provides 85% of the total cost of public education in New Bedford, while it only provides 4% of the total cost of public education in Wellesley. And you guys know those communities. Wellesley's a well-resourced community, New Bedford is not. If we were to take those steps and say, this is the best answer, this is the right answer, this is a principled answer, this answer has been done in every other state that's had this problem, and that it's wrong to say that the Claremont cases somehow constrained and handcuffed the legislature's appropriation power. If we say that, I don't believe this court is going to disagree. I think this court is going to say, we've been blamed for the legislature saying we have to distribute money on a per pupil basis, even with base adequacy throughout the state. I think that's false. I want to get it on the table because I think it's a critical preliminary issue for where we go. If we go down a path where we're going to determine the cost of adequacy per pupil, and the assumption in the back of our mind is that that means that money, once raised in the state, has got to be put out on a base adequacy level to every community on a per pupil basis, we're going down the wrong path in my view. And I want to thank each of you. This is the first time I've stated clearly my view of these cases. And I don't believe that either Dan Will or John Tobin disagreed with that. They focused on the horizontal replication language, which is clear. And I would like to start, Jay, with trying to get this legal issue about what are our guidelines or our hamstrung or our handcuffs, because otherwise we'll be wasting time in my view. Thank you for allowing me to address the commission.
Yeah, but Bill, before you relapse, and what would be, you ended with a suggestion of, and we should gather information on that legal basis.
I think that,
Where would we obtain that information?
well, number one, as I'm looking at my friends who are legislators on this committee, you all have your own towns. You've struggled in the world of, well, my town is going to need money, and I don't like what Bill's saying because that means Berlin, Pittsfield, Allenstown, Claremont, Manchester is going to get more money first. I am not a legislator, Jay. What I would do is have this commission for the very first time, with due respect, Iris, we have a budget and we've hired an expert who's bringing in information from outside of our New Hampshire silo. Let's build a great formula that is based on good principles. And Jay, at the end of that process, the legislature has the ability to ask the court for an opinion. The legislature also has the ability to say, this is what I believe is right, and put the judiciary to the test. When people say, Jay, and I want to repeat it, when people say, we can't do what's right because, don't blame me, blame the court, that court will simply be horrified if that's what. In fact, if you look at the Conval decision doesn't even get to this. It just says, look, the formula for figuring out what the statewide adequacy number is doesn't make any sense. We're not going to go anywhere else. They're not addressing this. Let's get a good, sound method for deciding what statewide adequacy is. Let's go to Dave's committee, have them create a decent, appropriate recommendation for taxing power to raise those state funds. And then on this committee, let's put together a formula to be proud of, one that really protects people, kids, families that are most in need. I'm serving on the Stakeholder Advisory Board right now for the coronavirus crisis. And let me tell you, the top line expenditures of those monies, as far as I'm concerned, are for things like child protection, child safety, public education, access to it. This is what we should do. And folks, we should not get lost anymore in this weird environment where we can't do what Massachusetts has done because the court said so. Jay, I don't think we have to say, Mother May I. Do the right thing, and I believe you'll win.
All right. Thank you. Iris.
Thanks. I couldn't figure out how to raise my hand
You
technologically.
did.
You were
I
good.
loved it.
Right in front of you.
I went to go back to the root. I really appreciate Bill's passion for this. And even though past efforts may not have landed where he wanted them to, they were in all sincerity based on that same passion. I would like to just point out that 10 years ago when the same work was done, all legal counsel advised us that the court's rulings were to be interpreted, that we had to fund whatever we defined as the cost of an adequate education statewide. Exactly the thing that Bill is arguing against now. Right, and that legal counsel involved the House legal counsel, the Senate legal counsel, the governor's legal counsel, the AG's office, just about, and there were a few exceptions outside, just about all legal counsel we consulted agreed that we were less constrained at that time. Now, 10 years later, we have a different court. And I'd like us to really keep that in mind, because what might have been acceptable or not acceptable 10 years ago may be acceptable to the current court. It doesn't mean that that is also an answer that would be acceptable to this commission, given, depending on how it's framed, or acceptable politically. Frankly, one of the biggest challenges, and we've certainly seen this in the last 10 years when any efforts that were made 10 years ago to address inequity have been wiped out over the legislature's last 10-year history, that the biggest obstacle is getting people to let go of what they currently have and do that for the sake of what Bill is arguing for. And I think that's a huge political obstacle, not one that we shouldn't take on, but I think it's one we need to consider. So I think that he's really spot on in raising this right off the bat, because it really relates to the wording of these tasks that we've been given. I looked at number 3, which says suggest a framework for a distribution of effort/funding that remedies disparities. And right away, that takes me to where Bill wants us to go, that our distribution framework is intended and designed to remedy inequity. But then we get down to number 4, and we've got a uniform and equitable design to the cause. So are we trying to go both places? Are we trying to only go one or the other? In other words, should the distribution framework be designed to remedy disparities and not cover the cost of inadequate education statewide? Or should it try and do just what it tried to do 10 years ago, which was cover the cost of adequacy and then build other mechanisms to try to address inequity? Or should it try and do both? Should we try and do both from the outset? I don't know, but I think it's a really fundamental discussion that he's put his finger on. And I'd love to see where other people stand. I don't know, just as the court has changed over the last 10 years, the legal opinion you would get from those we might consult in state has probably also changed. So I don't know where that leaves us to get a legal opinion.
With some decisions about our tasks and to try to work to some clarity in this list of 5. In number 4, if we're agreed on the first 3, which I can say that I was pleased in looking at the proposals from about our consultants and seeing their stepwise progression into the first 3 steps. So I think we've had a chance, I've had a chance anyway, to see are we consistent with what people are doing in other studies based on the feedback we got in the proposals. The item 4, I mean, clearly what was suggested at the commission meeting is we need to establish a cost of an adequate education. And we could say just that, establish the cost of an adequate education. That would be our task. How it is financed and truly is the task of another work group. And it is what I think we've come to recognize is there's overlap in the questions ultimately that the different work groups are doing. Somebody else?
Just agreeing with you, Jay.
I have a comment, but I would like to hear from all of the members who are on the call before I add in and follow up.
Well, if I could speak, not being a member of the work group.
Yeah, we'll get Jane next. Go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, okay. I agree with what you just said, Jay. I think that establishing the cost, the definition of an adequate education and its cost are fundamental tasks to the work of this commission. And they need to happen. And that's, I think, the primary task of this work group. And then that work feeds into the work of the commission. Also feeding into the work of the commission will be the work of the Fiscal Resource Group. And it's really at the commission level, to some extent in the Fiscal Resource Group's work as well, that these questions that Bill is raising come to the fore. Distribution, state funds being limited as they are. Gosh knows, I know that. I'm sitting on Ways and Means looking at a frightening outlook. And And so big questions. And here we have school funding, and its overall cost, we know, even apart from the work that you're going to be doing, is very large. And so there are big questions there. But I think that feeds into the work of the commission. We need to have this discussion of the law. The discussion is going on in another forum as we speak, in Superior Court, in a place that will almost certainly feed into the Supreme Court soon enough. And so we'll all get enlightenment through that process and through our own interplay of points of view. That should be in the commission. I think this work group needs to plow ahead. We've got a consultant soon. We'll be choosing a consultant within the next week who's going to dig into this question of adequacy and its costs. Let's go forward with that. And we could spend days, weeks, months debating the question of state funding obligation. At some point, we're going to engage in that debate, and we're going to have to draw it to a close before months pass. But we're just going to have to go forward and do that and argue it out, hear from all points of view, including outside points of view. Let that happen, but go forward with adequacy. Thank you.
Thanks, Dick. Jane, and then Barbara.
Sure. I would agree that the bullets 3 and 4 kind of conflict. And when I read that, I was taken aback. I would definitely support Bill's pitch to us around developing a formula that really is directed towards and meets the needs of our most challenged school districts, because there is such inequity. And even though it may be a political difficulty for us, if we can put that aside, and it will also be interesting and important for us to, when we start gathering feedback from our various stakeholders, what their thoughts are on it.
Well, number 3 is aiming to get to where I think Bill is encouraging us to see the state appropriation as a means for remedying disparities. So that we're good with 3, but I don't want to leave that impression that we were failing to articulate that we need to establish a cost of adequate education as an outcome of our work group.
Yes, I agree that number 3 is a big one. We need to look at the disparities and also what other items we might want to include under the definition of an adequate education. So that will come forward. And Iris, I really appreciate you talking a bit about the process 10 or so years ago of how this all went through. The original proposal, as you know, Iris, and so forth, was not what we're all living with now. Isn't that correct? But we have to, our group needs to go forward in producing what we believe is right for an adequate education and go on. So I appreciated that historical, Iris, your historical view. Of course, I was a superintendent all during those years and know what we all lived with, but knowing also all the work that went into it and how it was changed through the courts and so forth. But our job is to go forward with what we believe is the best from now on. And I just have to say, Iris, I appreciate your background and knowledge. It's been helpful to us. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Barbara.
Jay?
Okay. Yeah, David.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jay. First of all, I wanted to say we Bruce and I completed the reference checks over the last few days for the respondents to the RFP. And we learned a lot through those as well, because we spoke with commissioners of education. We spoke with people that directed the research. We spoke with a researcher from Stanford University. We spoke with a number of people, and not to get into the proposals and RFP, that's not my point, but we learned a lot about what other states are doing, and I think it ties right into what Bill was sharing earlier, where I think a lot of people think of New Hampshire as an adequacy state. The state's defined adequacy and pays for adequacy, and the districts can figure out the rest themselves. And some other states are actually called equity states, and I think Bill, it sounds like Massachusetts may be along those lines. You're muted right now, so I can't hear you. We can't hear you.
I don't think so. They construed the exact same adequacy clause, but I'll address it. I like what you're saying, so let me not interrupt.
Yeah, no, that's yeah, and I'm not sure if I'm saying it right. It's not sort of like not either you're an adequacy state or you're an equity state, but where the focus of the distribution is based on this concept called fiscal neutrality. And reading from the definition, and we'll be talking about this, I think, in the at the 3 o'clock work group today, but fiscal neutrality assesses the link between local wealth and the amount of revenue available to support a school district. A touchstone of school finance theory asserts that there should be little or no relationship between local wealth, such as local property tax base, and the amount of resources available to a local school district. A school finance system with high fiscal neutrality minimizes the relationship between local wealth or capacity and district spending. So I just wanted to lay that out there. Thank you, Jay.
All right, David. So Bill, we're at 10:34. We're needing to move on, and yes, make another point.
One more to just say,
yeah.
I think in listening to this, the thing that I would strongly urge that we help people unbundle is the process of defining adequacy, developing a cost estimate, which is total for the statewide, raising that money with taxes that have a proportional rate throughout the state. That's the taxing power. That I completely support Dick in his view that that's a principal job of this commission, defining adequacy, determining the total statewide amount. But that is only half of our task. I think it's absolutely within the scope of this working group to say, let's address the appropriation power, because simply raising the money and putting it in a state account doesn't answer the question of what's right about what are we trying to address? Are we trying to say that we should have a state financed public school system? What are the, I don't know if it's just that, just do it, raise the money and distribute on a per pupil basis. Now, the appropriation power is separate from the taxing power. We need to unbundle that. When we distribute the money, the court cases have not, they never cited one provision in our Constitution that affects the legislature's appropriation power. And so if the state said our first priority is distribute funds to achieve, Dave, what that was a great citation of the goal, distribute and appropriate funds first to try and get neutrality, right? So that when the state says, distributing and delegating local property tax power is a good way to go because you vest local communities in their public education. Let's assume that's within the fiscal policy work group, frankly, that we say that. Well, that creates disparities. It turns out that Hampton has more property wealth than Claremont. If the state funds are distributed in a manner to achieve adequacy in that district of Claremont, where I went, that's Iris, I apologize, that's my passion here. That's my community that I grew up in and played basketball and baseball. But I think what you want to do is give Claremont families the same chance. And I think we have to stand up and fight for that the legislature indeed has the power to address those disparities. And Jay, I strongly urge, if Dick was saying defer the distribution formula stuff, defer the goals of raising adequacy and determining cost till some later point, I think it's separating and delaying what we need to do. Because, Dick, I think that the distribution formula is going to fundamentally impact the definition of adequacy. And because if it's a per pupil cost across the whole state, that's going to produce a larger number that the state needs to raise potentially. And I think that, Jay, I think we should do both. And I think we should unbundle them. Taxing power, statewide adequacy, appropriation power, distribute to eliminate inequities. I wanted to get it on the table, and I thank you. And I will, Jay, I get your hint. I'll be quiet for the rest of the call. Thank you.
I would be disappointed in that. But so I do want to settle on the 5 tasks because we do need to establish timelines and what kind of tasks we want to take on, what kind of tasks we need to delegate to others. Jane, did you get your few cents in here? I believe in what you just said, Bill, again, that when we are talking about, I've got some feedback there. When we're talking about topic 3, task 3, funding that remedies disparities, I think we're striking at your appropriation.
That's the appropriation power. That doesn't involve taxing power. That says once you've determined a statewide cost and raised it, now you're going to decide how to spend it.
And that's that. So we're in alignment there.
Yes, I agree with that. I think the 5 items are appropriate, but I just want to make sure we agree. Because I think, honestly, I think you've heard Dick is concerned properly about, hey, wait a minute. If this committee gets into the issue of what are the proper principles for appropriation, we're getting a tiger by the tail in philosophically and politically that maybe we don't want to address yet. And Iris is saying, last time we went through this, everyone said the New Hampshire had handcuffs that were so tight, you got to do the same amount in Hampton as you do in Claremont. We have to go at both.
Which the establishing an adequate cost allows us to do, right?
We definitely have to establish an adequacy cost with a formula that makes sense statewide.
Yeah.
Jay, I haven't had an opportunity to say anything yet. This is Rick.
Go for it, Rick.
I concur with the approach and what Bill is saying and what you as a subcommittee group are saying. I believe that going back 10 years ago, when Iris set that formula, that there was good intent to support what we're trying to address right now. The only issue is that the per capita methodologies have been hijacked by politicians and to their good to serve their community. I'm looking at one section of our statute right now. It's 193E2C, and it's a very short statute that I'd like to read. The general court recognizes that schools with greater educational challenges will benefit from varying resources. Schools with varying educational challenges often exist within a single school district. The General Court is committed to addressing the varying educational challenges that exist among schools of the state. I don't believe that the initial formula attempted to address some of that. However, we stripped it away, and I hope that we can get into the discussion of how we're appropriating money, the costing. That is very much an adequacy issue that must be resolved. And to do that, I believe we got to get away from hanging our hat so much on per capita.
And Rick, you're referring to the distributed aid components of the formula, right?
That's correct, which have been basically stripped. Other than ELL and SPED and free and reduced. Every school gets that stuff. But what we need to do is we need to just roll this thing back and take the fiscal, how we're going to tax, and let fiscal handle that. This committee has to do the costing bit, the costing of an adequate opportunity for an education. I think we missed that challenge, and let's get on with it and make this thing work. This is our one opportunity. We've missed this one. I think we've blown it. Great.
All right. With that, I mean, I think we've got a lot of ideas that are as much principles for where we want to go, and hopefully they're captured in our task definitions. That if we define adequate education, we identify the disparities both in opportunities, the inputs, and in the outcomes, you know, how schools are performing, how students are performing. We get into a framework of a distribution of the effort, and specifically as to how we're going to fund and funding that's going to remedy disparities. We're going to focus on what would it take to equalize those opportunities, remedy the disparities, and against an established adequate education cost. And there we go. That's what we're aiming to do. Good? Then we'll move on to the second portion. The goal that I had in wanting to talk about the definition of adequacy, and in this starting point that Bruce captured from a discussion I wanted to start over the weekend, is the outcome of this is to try to see how much of what we have mandated as education in the state needs to be a part of adequacy. And not so much to come down hard and fast today, but to recognize that in the least, we've got to say in our report, this is why we've included these things, and here's some things that we've decided to exclude from the adequacy cost for now, and why we decided to do that. So when I started the statement, you know, why does it cost $20,000 to educate a student? It's because we've got about 170,000 students in the state of New Hampshire, and we heard from the Department of Revenue Administration, we're spending $3.2 million a year. That was, you know, based on 2019. So we've improved those. At any rate, we're spending $20,000 on average per pupil per year. You want to look at that on a complete universe basis. You can go to what we'll talk to in a few minutes, the iPlatform, and you can look at it and see that we're spending at a top end of $46,000 in one school district, and in a low end in the, you know, just over around $12,000. So we've got a wide range. You could strike a median, you can take the average. The point is, $20,000, depending what you put in the bushel basket of an adequate education, it probably overstates what we're spending on the definition of adequate education. That's what we need to arrive at, because we need to determine things like how much of special education costs are going to be a part of an adequate education. And right now our statutes are in a manner that it distinguishes between different parts of special education costs. Career technical education is a part of adequate education, except for the transportation components. And we ought to consider also, are we using technical education in the state to the extent that we should be if we want workforce outcomes? Early childhood is a part of our charge, but it's outside anything that we've put into adequate education definitions in the past. Yet we know that school districts are paying for pre-K services in part through federal funding and in part through school district funding. We know that since 2008, the kinds of trouble that schools have been facing with discipline and with emotional and social behavior disorders has grown vastly. We have mandated SS to be a systematic treatment of behavior on school districts, as well as certain professional development of all employees, from kitchen staff to bus staff to tutors and volunteers and teachers in schools, to be trained on identifying depression and suicidal tendencies. We've mandated a lot of professional development for assessment. There's nothing in the formulas about professional development. I failed to put that in here. We have mandated school breakfast in addition to lunch. And what are some of the costs associated with it? We've mandated school safety conditions. Some schools have adopted school resource officers. Some have used crossing guards, but we have mandated certain standards for behavior in schools and adhering in schools to develop policies regarding bullying and other kinds of behavior that are forbidden. Then there's the out-of-district placements that take place, and do we put those in? There's the question about the upper grade premium that elementary districts have to pay for in order to tuition into a comprehensive K through 12. All right, so these are things that are all part of statute. The Carsey School has, through Bruce, has offered to take something that Rick had started. Rick Ladd, Representative Ladd, had started. Here are some things that I observe in statute that relate to adequacy costs. We ought to go through the bundle of from RSA 186 to RSA 200. 200 is healthcare or health education. That too is another element of cost. And consider where some of those cost items, we might want to ask school business officers to do a roundtable with us about costs that they feel are mandated by the state, so that we don't artificially put lids on, is the school nurse in or out, kind of thing. So those are some thoughts about adequate education. And I made reference to, I hope we did here, yes, the under B, the 2008 study that in the 2008 study, it's summarized on pages 24 through 26, what they determined at that time, Iris, the average cost per pupil. And I believe the State Department of Education is working on updating those costs for us, so that we could just see, okay, 2008 costs to 2020 costs, what do we know about that? And then we can use that framework as a starting point to, is this getting us close to where we want to go on an adequate education, and we're just going to build on that? Or is there something fundamentally wrong with using averages, driving to an average in order to determine the cost of adequacy? So with that, I think if this is our first task, we need to have a time schedule and an approach for how we're going to tackle what's in the bushel basket and what, for the time being, we're going to leave outside for another conversation.
So, Jay, trying to think about how to do that and what the timeline is. And so, yes, Carsey can begin to, again, expand upon, build on what Rick started a week ago, some time ago, in terms of kind of a scan of existing definitions of what goes in the bushel basket. So we'll get that started, but I guess I also wonder if the members of this work group can begin to do some of their own thinking, referencing the 2008 report and recommendations, and not to do anything definitive at this point, but just begin to make some judgments about in 2020, given the list of expenses that you've just identified in your paragraph and just now, everything from school resource officers to school breakfasts to upper grade premiums. Can our task force members begin to, for individually, sort out what goes in the bushel basket and not, and maybe do that before our next meeting. In the meantime, we'll provide some additional analysis. We'll also certainly be starting with this task with our consultant that we retain. Yeah. That contract probably won't be in place realistically for 10 days to 2 weeks, and then they'll have to get started. So we probably won't really have draft information from them around the definition of adequacy. I'm going to guess it could be 4 weeks out, something, trying to be realistic here. So.
And, one of the things, and Bill, I see.
Sorry, I don't know.
One of the things that we can begin to think about, we might even put a grid together, just with the list as the Carsey School identifies, hey, here are the many mandates. Here's the centrality to the question. and give a plus, 0, and minus to each of the items, that just to rate them. And I mean, some of these things I think we'd see as central, and some of these things, like, I might consider early childhood education and pre-K to be outside the bushel basket. Somebody else might say, no, that's fundamental to achieving third grade proficiency levels. So it needs to be inside. But I think maybe we could take some shots at it personally, and then be prepared to share those, and then be informed by the kind of multi-state comparisons that the consultants can give to us. Bill, you wanted to?
Yes, thank you. I wanted to agree, Jay, with the way you're speaking. You say what the public sees is that public education in New Hampshire costs, $19,000-$20,000 per pupil. That makes New Hampshire at least, depending on how you count it nationally, 11th highest spending per pupil in the country, just behind Massachusetts. And when we go through the exercise that Iris went through and Rick went through years ago, and I know from all of them, it happened in 1999 too, and come to a conclusion that says, because of fiscal policy concerns, adequacy costs, base adequacy, $3,701 per pupil. We don't have an adequacy definition and cost that helps the public really understand how important public education is to our state. We're serving a different purpose. What I like about what you're saying is we should really take a good look at what the total cost is generally on average throughout the state, or whatever, because I think the state can look at that. And then, now remember, doing that, which I think is mission critical for this work group and the commission, gets you the statewide money. That doesn't talk about how it's distributed. I want to separate appropriation, but doing that is really important. And to come up with a number that's reasonably defensible to a parent who's worried about choosing schools, a community where to take their kids. And I think we got to have something that is defensible. Now, Iris is going to say, yeah, but Bill, if we put it above 3701, it's because it has to go to every district on a per pupil basis, the cost blows the budget. Separate the two, taxing, appropriation.
I'd like to say myself.
Yes.
I wouldn't necessarily say that. So
thank you. I'm trying to.
Okay.
I'd like to hear it.
Are you going to finish, or Bill, do you need to finish?
Yes. So the first is to say, let's go. And second, the experts. The experts, we're not going to have to recreate the wheel here. Almost every state has done this, and these experts have probably done it 25 times. Immediately, if we get outside of our New Hampshire silo, we will get great data, great comparison, and I urge it. And the final point is history. You've got statutory and court references. Before 2008, there was Governor Lynch's proposal in 2006 for educational equity index, excellence in education plan. That plan, I would like to ask Carsey to do the research and bring all the legislative history of that plan forward. It got through the House, it didn't make it through the Senate, but it costed on a completely different basis, on the basis of quality. And I would make sure that we have that in front of our group as an opportunity to come up with a way of valuing adequacy that focuses on differentials. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a all right, Iris, take it away.
No, I don't have anything to add. I just didn't like having my thoughts characterized, and they do change over time, and I've tried to express that. That's it.
let me apologize to Iris for misstating. I didn't mean it. I have the utmost respect for Iris Esterbrook. I watched her when she was in the legislature. Iris, I apologize to you for doing that. I won't do it again.
And may I cut in for a second, please? Jordan, my screen is very unstable, and I was kicked off and I'm back on now, but it's unstable. I'm getting some verbal and not, and there's no, my screen's showing folks, but freezes. And then there's no picture of myself on the screen.
Yeah, I'm Rick. If you do just turn your video off, you're likely to get a more stable signal. The whole system these days is, under a lot of stress. And our experience has been that if you just reduce the demand you're putting on your local system by turning off your video, which is it's off now.
It's off now, yes.
And your audio at least will be stable and we can hear what you're saying.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Jay,
Yes, Dick.
I just wanted to add to what you're asking. I think it's a good inquiry, a good way to start the inquiry. But in that 2008 work that Iris was so much a part of, 2007 to 8, there was this difference between the universal cost of an adequate education and differentiated cost items. So when we talk about a bushel basket, it sort of had within it certain elements that universally apply. The classroom teacher, for example, and supplies, basic things. And then pouring into that were other costs. Special education is a perfect example. And now I think it's $1,800 or so that goes into that basket. So that in fact, the cost of an adequate education with a school that just had one special ed kid in it and that's it, would be not $3,800, it would be $5,600. And that's how the cost of education was determined for the needy kids, the kids eligible for a free or reduced price lunch. It's sort of a little bit different because there was a concentration feature built into that formula for the poor end. So schools that had a high concentration of kids that came from lower income households would get extra based on the concentration. And so that's an interesting feature. And as you work through this, I think there are some elements, maybe school counselors would be an example, that would feed into that core, universal part of the basket. And there would be other features, maybe career and technical education would be in that other category that would maybe, or maybe not, you need to discuss this, pour in to the basket as differentiated cost items. I found it a useful way of thinking about what is cost of education, and you might too.
Yeah, good suggestion, Dick. And it is clearly distinguished, those two categories in the 2008 study. So we commend ourselves to take a look at that. Is there a desire to hear from a couple of school business officers at the front end of this? We don't have them represented in the commission. Not that one person necessarily could represent a range, but if we could get a couple of folks to join us for 45 minutes of one of our meetings and just run through a list once we've prepared that and do what Dick just said. Is this applicable to every child, or is this a differentiated cost that should be recognized in the bushel basket, but not as applied, as applicable for every child.
May I enter here,
So
Jay?
I'll add school business officers and work with,
I've got a couple of names for you that I got from Caitlin Davis. But if anybody else has somebody who's outstanding, let us know.
Jay, I would suggest possibly SAU 48, which is Plymouth and all of the small towns, because they have such a range of diversity from one of the poorest to one of the most wealthy in the same SAU. I think that viewpoint would be important to us.
I think we also should be very clear what we're asking them to prepare for us.
Yep.
So Bruce, if you're the one or whoever contacts these, make sure we understand what we want them to do and how they might present it to us. So we just don't want to hear the whole budget. We want to hear, so very clear what we're asking them to prepare.
good, good, thanks.
Rick, did you have something?
Yeah, I think that we need to get a district in terms of what you're searching for. Perhaps the costs of educating a child in high school is very different than that of a child in elementary school.
Correct.
And the cost of funding a high school student is much different in certain communities. Now you come to a smaller community like the one I'm in, Haverhill, or if you go further north, Plymouth is even different than Haverhill. If you're talking about what we've introduced in our legislation, STEM, concurrent dual enrollment, all the issues that are brought forward by increased technology, robotics, engineering, that is very difficult to do in a small community versus where you have efficiency of scale, larger school. So I think that we need to also go search out that district which is smaller and doesn't have the CTE program internal to the school. So the costing, even on the high school level, is going to be based upon population density, enrollment, which those are some of the factors we saw in the Vermont study.
Correct.
Those are some of those weighting factors, right? As
Yes.
we think
Right.
of a child as one.
And as I mentioned in the RFP group the other day, this is the major issue that we see in the southern part of Vermont that's bringing forth the Claremont type questioning of their constitutional efforts to provide an adequate education. Deals with enrollment and density. And that was insisted upon by those smaller districts that they incorporate that into their adequacy formula, the costing of it.
Of providing a more equal opportunity.
Yes, to eliminate those disparities.
Yep. Good. Anything more on this at this point? Are there other sources of information that we may want? We've got the business officers, we've got our consultants, and the Department of Education working to update 2008 costs so that we can see where we're based on currently and perhaps with a different set of costs and 12 years later where we are today.
Jay, I would just add in Governor Lynch's plan did a disparity calculation. It'd be good to have that as part of our history.
Yeah, yeah. We got to look at that study and see.
I've got that. We'll track that down. Yep.
Great. Yeah. Great.
Jay, could you find out, working with Bruce, through maybe the Department of Education, through Caitlin, we have a district up here that's using adequacy money to supplement that which is also special ed money to do preschool. That's Piermont I'm talking about. How many districts in the state currently are trying to operate a preschool program that's for all students, not just those identified through Child Find or some program to find if you have a disability, but for all children. I'd like to know that if we have people engaged in that throughout the state right now.
Yeah, I've got one Fall Mountain district that is doing that for all students. And yeah, I mean, you got the Head Start money and districts have just taken that and moved to offer 3 to 5 early childhood education. Jane, you must have some examples of that too.
Yeah, there's a lot of those examples throughout the state. Some of our school districts even have dedicated buildings of just early learning preschool. So Hudson, Londonderry, Goffstown have built school buildings just for early learning.
We're seeing it up here due to the shrinking enrollment population. Kindergarten classes in some schools have shrunk down to 6 kids. The way they're sustaining that teacher is by bringing in the preschool population.
And so as we try to swing from definition of adequacy to definition of how to drive more successful outcomes, unfortunately, we probably don't have enough evidence on these full day or full enrollment opportunity, open enrollment for preschool. We don't know the impact on 3rd grade performance.
I don't know about that, but it's nice to be discussing whether to include kindergarten.
Well, that was the next thought. And now that it is mandated, I mean, or at least fully funded, it's not mandated, it's fully funded, local district option. But yeah, it would be nice if we had 4 years of history to see if it moved the needle in districts on 3rd grade proficiency. But we don't.
No, but what I was saying was I think there is other research that shows that a quality early childhood experience has a direct impact on school performance and 3rd grade proficiency.
Very high correlation.
I think
Very
that's
high correlation.
yeah.
High
I think
correlation.
that's shown. Whether it's a state obligation we want to assume is another question.
What's going on?
Yeah. Well, we are trying to drive to outcomes, right? More successfully. Chris.
Well, your discussion about, I mean, only quality programs produce those outcomes. And unfortunately, what we know across the country is there are very few programs that meet the requirements that would produce those outcomes. But that's more a general one to raise. I think this committee would help the rest of us by really tackling the concepts behind quality and adequacy and make sure that we're all on the same page as we get further down the road. The term adequacy has always bothered me, as I'm sure it bothers lots of other people, but it is the kind of term of art in this field. And I don't think adequacy, I think the way we're talking about adequacy, it means more than just a layman's understanding of adequacy. And so I think we need to make sure we communicate that in some way, or that we come up with a term that we're comfortable with that's, I think, going to be somewhere between adequacy and quality, and will be mediated by looking at outcomes. With one of the answers to a question from the proposal interviews that was done about was this notion of, you know, since this work was originally done in New Hampshire, everything about how people think about the basis for adequacy has changed, and in terms of methodologies. And so we need to, I don't know, I can't suggest how, but I think it's really important that this committee makes sure that other committees are on the same page around that terminology.
I'm glad you raised that, Chris. I think it's more important for this committee than the others. We all have definitional questions. I think it's very important for this committee to try to provide some definitions of some of our key terms. So when we talk about outcomes and disparities and adequacy, we should be defining what's meant by these for the other committees so that we have some common definitions.
So Jay?
Bruce, David.
Yeah. So these are also some of the things that that keep me awake at night. And you know, what are the things that feed into a definition of adequacy, for example, and sort of a, and I also wonder a little bit about if what the difference is between what could go into the definition of adequacy and what could go into the definition, and this taken out of court decisions, the quote, opportunity for an adequate education. Because I think those are could be two different things. And the I don't know, in my sort of simple, dense construction of this, I'm not sure if the idea of outcomes factors into, quote, the opportunity for an adequate education. Maybe it should, maybe it shouldn't. I don't know. But again, you know, things that I sort of, you know, keep me up at night. So I've been trying to build, I find this one of the hard things to do on Zoom meetings, as opposed to when we're meeting in a room when we've got a whiteboard and we can draw on things and people can get up and try different things, is you know, looking at these definitions as sort of circles, and what are the things that would sort of feed into these definitions, and sort of brainstorming that. And you know, I don't know if that would be something that the work group would be interested in, you know, in doing, and how that could be accomplished. And obviously our research, you know, contractor is going to play a large role in this as well. But anyway, that's just you know, what your discussion here just sort of reminded me of what knocks around in my head at 3 a.m.
Hey, Dave, and follow up to what you just talked about, the outcomes. When we look at 193E, 1, 2, and 3, when you look at 193E3, we're talking about accountability for the opportunity for an adequate education.
Mm-hmm.
The study that came out back in November 2008 addressed two segments. One was the costing of an adequate education. The other was accountability for an adequate education. And both are pretty thorough reports. I'd like to know, in terms of the adequacy group right here, whether they're going to be addressing accountability issue, the outcomes.
Well, Rick, I think that's an excellent point, and you know, and this sort of goes back to some of the reference check work, the conversations that we had. In some cases, the accountability is determined by whether or not the school district applied the funds the way they were intended to be applied. As opposed to looking at, you know, did all the kids get, you know, what percentage of kids got a, you know, proficiency grade on the last set of standardized tests. So I think there's different ways to consider that, but I think that's probably something that is more closely related to this work group's tasks than it is the others. But
now we currently have inputs and outputs. The inputs being a narrative report, the outputs, generally speaking, mimicking the Elementary Secondary Schools Act, which is the testing we do, the statewide testing. But we don't do statewide testing to assess all aspects of our adequate education. It's just basically mathematics and reading language.
that's right.
And so I think on the output side, we're really lacking, and I don't know if the testing is the only way. It's not the only way to have accountability. And
Right.
I think that we need to walk down that road a little bit and have something that's a little bit more relevant and useful for the teacher in the classroom.
Listen, I agree with both Dave and Rick. Rick, in fact, on Jay's list of 5 tasks, accountability is specifically identified. And Bruce and Carsey, why hasn't Dave Luno perfectly identified an exhibit that can be produced by our consultant if it's a Venn diagram of what other states have incorporated?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so that you can kind of see the differences across the country. That sounds like a very useful visual image to help organize work.
No, that's exactly the kind of thing we will ask the consultant to do. Again, we don't have them with us today, but within a few short weeks, I hope we'll be able to do that with them. And they'll join us with these meetings. They'll be with us on the calls.
So maybe to wrap up this section, I'd like to refer you to item C in our 10:30 slot here. I hope you'll go to the Department of Education's website and look at the I-platform, and you'll find just a wealth of information that you can begin to draw down some univariate statistics, just average cost per student, 3rd grade proficiency levels. You can look at the variation to the average across the spectrum of schools in the state, and you can see the variation that there is among them. Anyway, you can even do 2 variables at the same time. So you can have spending per school versus outcomes in 3rd grade, and see, see how schools stack up that way. The point is, there's a lot of information there that our consultants are going to be importing into their database. And if it's not there, what you're looking for, then we've probably got some problem. Meaning that there may be some data that we're interested in that we need to search other sources, ask different questions than what the data collection currently is in the state. So I think getting familiar with the inputs, average class size, teacher salary, experience of the teachers by district, those are the inputs. The outcomes, as Rick said, they're limited, but we do have proficiency, college going rates, graduation rates, withdrawal rates, and so.
Jay, in addition to this excellent work at DOE with Caitlin Davis has done a lot of great stuff. How about, I know Reaching Higher has done a very good study with some real interactive data. That's also a good point to cite to get background.
So a great segue to the next conversation, Bill, thank you, which is as we turn the page to a next meeting, hopefully with consultants at our side, because it's not until the 18th. So we have a couple of questions about how we want to structure our work. We've got a meeting on the 18th. We wouldn't meet otherwise until like the very end of May. I guess it'd be June 1st. So Reaching Higher can't make it on May 11th to the full commission meeting. So on May 18th, a suggestion is that they present to our committee. They could scratch the data that you just mentioned. We could do some homework with the I-platform just so that we can see the variables and ask questions that, why didn't you use this in your demographic profiles? And And so we could spend an hour that way with Reaching Higher and seeing how they've used the data in the past. Sound like a good thing for us on the 18th?
Yes, from my perspective. Although I disclosed my wife serves on that board, and that's how I learned about it.
If we had to exclude everything that you and Cass serve on, we'd be without many resources.
Jay, I think that's a great idea, and might even suggest that fiscal policy overlaps their meeting at that same time with Reaching Higher on the 18th.
Good. Okay, all right, maybe figure that out. Maybe you guys go ahead of us and we.
Yeah, it's either the tail end of our meeting. Yeah, that would be that might be a way to do it. So, but we'll figure out that schedule.
Yeah.
And Jay, let's see, May 18th, we will at least be in negotiations with our consultant at that point. We may not have a signed contract, but we'll be in process. And what we know about these two firms, I expect that even if we don't have a signed contract, they'll be willing to join us, at least to listen in, and then to tell us what they're going to begin to be able to offer to us relative to the definition and costing of adequacy at the 18th. So I think we can, at this point, assume we'll be able to be joined by a representative of the firm.
Mm-hmm.
And Jay, if we could get the data from Reaching Higher ahead of time so that we could be prepared with questions, that would be helpful.
On the CARSI website, on the School Commission CARSI website, the most recent Reaching Higher report is linked.
Okay.
The whole picture, I think it's called The Whole Picture of Public Education. And you can really drill pretty far in there. They have what they call community profiles.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of demographic, quantitative information about the community context as well as about school performance and, again, inputs and outputs that are being spent there. And Jordan is just on the chat board, posted that link.
Okay.
The other thing that we want to hear from Reaching Higher about, I think briefly at least, is what their research efforts are going forward. They're doing this deep 30 community investigation currently with support from the Charitable Foundation. And they're starting by analyzing the impact of teacher salary, teacher compensation on student performance, student outcomes. So that's just a good example of an input variable tied to an outcome variable that will be helpful to us, informative to us.
Okay. Are there other reports? Bill, you mentioned the 2006 report. We'll try to get that link and make sure that we're all maybe focused to a couple of pages in that report that provide the high-level summary. Anything else for homework purposes?
Do you want me to reach out to the school business officers, the state association, and at least begin to identify a few of those folks, maybe for our June 1st meeting? I thought that was an interesting suggestion.
Well, let's talk about June 1st. It seems like if it's going to seem like we're moving slow.
Yeah,
is my concern. I also am concerned that come June 1st, it's likely that the legislature will find a way out of its cocoon and start to flap wings. So I think if we could find another date in May, and given that the commission is meeting on the 26th, my point is if we use some date in the week of the 18th as the second meeting date.
I agree. I think we need to be there. And it could be that by then, our consultant would actually at least be able to inform us about how they're going to go about the national or selected state comparisons around definitions of adequacy and costing of adequacy. So I would suggest, we're on a Thursday today, I would suggest maybe Thursday the 21st of May, perhaps in this same time slot for a meeting of this work group.
Jay, you're muted.
Sorry. So on the 18th, we've got the Reaching Higher presentation. We could use the 22nd for the business officers to drill down on cost of adequacy and what they feel needs to be in the bushel basket. And we could have the average cost update to take a look at. Maybe that's a reasonable time frame to set for ourselves there. And I mean, these are decent goals, right? To have, we'll be making some progress on those two questions. Good.
Yeah. So you said May 22nd. It does, either way.
Is that's for Friday? 21st is Thursday.
21st is a Thursday. 22nd.
Okay, so 21st, right? Well, 21st. We'll aim for 10 o'clock on the 21st.
Okay.
And we'll on the 18th we'll dovetail with the
Fiscal
policy committee, so that and I think for the fiscal, I think it's important for us at the front end maybe to have the Reaching Higher presentation. David, would you mind if we went like that it occurred at the back end of the fiscal policy meeting?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
So we'll probably wind up meeting at 3 o'clock on that Monday. That.
Mm-hmm.
And overlap the first hour, roughly 3 to 4, with fiscal policy. And then fiscal policy goes off, we break off, we continue our work, et cetera. Is that what you're saying?
That's essentially
right. You could even start your meeting at 2 o'clock. If fiscal policy started at 1, we would essentially meet from 1 to 3, and you would meet from 2 to 4 if you wanted to get an earlier start.
I think that's a nice way to do it.
Which day would
we could, if we went an extra, if we needed the extra time, we've got a few extra minutes at the back end. It certainly works for this committee.
Right. That's on the 18th, Iris.
Oh, thank you. I couldn't do that hour on the Thursday. Thanks.
So everyone would be good on the 18th from 2 to 4. On the 21st from 10 to 12. All right.
What's the time on the 21st, Jay?
At 10 to 12.
10 to 12.
And the agenda for the 21st is school business officers and average cost update from DOE. And then a presentation from our consultants on other state comparators in terms of definitions of adequacy. It won't be a complete, probably an initial presentation on that topic.
Yeah, and one of the homework assignments for the Reaching Higher on the 18th would be the Lynch report reference. And Bill, is that 2010?
No, it was when he first was elected. So 2005, 2006, House bill. I think it was like 460. I can't remember the number, but it was a House Bill 100 and House Bill 4 something. And I can try and forward those links. I worked with Governor Lynch's transition team on that.
That'd be great if you could do that, Bill. You could probably find it quicker than I can. Yeah.
Hey, Jay,
on the 21st, when you have the business officers in attendance, is it possible to have them or somebody they work with also getting into issues associated with transportation on the district levels? Costing of transportation, what are the factors which are driving it up? I know it's labor, it's cost of buses, insurance, all that stuff, but the linear mileage and all that, somewhere along the way, we're gonna have to start looking at how we're gonna cost out transportation.
Thanks, Rick. And you mentioned that a few times. I guess we'll pass that on.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Jay, something else we probably may want to consider too is, and this has sort of come up, I think, over the last few days in a variety of different meetings, but the costs that school districts will face as a result of COVID-19, and because it's not just, obviously it's not just, spring of 2020, but this is going to be going on a while. And then of course there's what we learned coming out of this too. And whether that's preparedness factors in the buildings and across districts, or it's technology availability, deployment, stuff like that. And there's lots of discussions right now about, blended learning models too.
Dave, we're collecting some of that information from our association in regards to special ed costs.
Okay.
Compensatory education anticipated, all of the additional costs that have come along due to COVID.
Mm-hmm.
So the tension in that kind of conversation is what's the one time versus the recurring costs.
And it may be worth trying to identify, some of the expertise we want to bring into that discussion. I know Rick and I have talked with Perry Plummer a number of times when it comes to building safety, but I'm sure there's others that play roles in this sort of.
Yeah, there's a whole lot we can do in this regard, Dave. There's other areas, like if you were to talk to the tech people down in Bedford, what are the additional costs that COVID has brought on in terms of remote learning using technology and the demands on technology? It's a very weak component within our base adequacy formula now. It's just a whole new ballgame we're moving toward here. And, this area of technology is key to making it function.
Certainly hit the accelerator on the blended learning, right down to kindergarten level, right?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
I expect the school business officers will help us sort of catalog all those categories of costs, both one-time and recurring, for COVID as well as the other categories like transportation. And I'm wondering, reference back to special education and Jane's comment, would we want, given that special education costs are a significant part of the differentiated aid right now, and that it's mandated and so on, would we want a presentation from Jane's association or representatives perhaps out on around June 1st? Or do we want to wait and see where we are on May 21st and then decide who to invite for June 1st?
Jane, I think Bruce is making a valuable suggestion that we ought to do that, meaning tune into how central to education special education is, that big label, special education, are really distinct to working with a specific case, a specific IEP, for instance. I mean, some of the assessment for special education, some of the services that are kind of bringing students up to grade level quickly, like in the first few years of education, some of those I feel like are in the bushel basket. And then some of the special education services that are very unique and follow the student all the way through their educational cycle, through 12th grade and maybe even beyond by age level to 21. Those are exceptional costs and need to be treated maybe differently outside of the bushel basket as exceptional costs. Do we need to have that understanding somewhere along the way?
I think that would be important as you know, part of our conversation, because you do have all of those layers. You have the essential components of special education, and then you have your more specialized aspects, and then you have the whole issue of, you know, the monies that are given to or dedicated to charter schools. You know, we're providing the costs for all the special education in the charter schools, which is a huge expense. And I think the whole conversation around special education aid is a real issue. And I think even your business managers will speak to that also. But the cost of special education continue to go up, and the aid provided, the special ed aid, has not increased at all. So I think those conversations will be important for us to consider.
And special education is not the only cost that school districts bear for charter schools in their district, right?
Well, I'm focused more on the special ed piece. I'm not quite sure what other expenses from a school district go to. I mean, obviously transportation, but that's connected to the special ed piece. But we can give you some of that information.
Good.
Jay,
Yeah, Iris.
yeah, you're raising the issue of charter schools. It's really interesting because right now they get considerably more per student. And is that going to be part of our conversation going forward?
Yeah, I think you raised, I mean, I wrote it down too. Where will we fit? You know, it has to be part of it. It's I don't think that can come out of the bushel basket.
The charter school issue is also a costing issue that we need to address, seeing that they don't have taxing authority as does a school district.
Well, maybe it does.
And I think special education too, Senator, it's such a huge topic in terms of how we're costing that out or how we're funding it, from Medicaid to schools to special ed for the old catastrophic aid to the special ed component within the adequacy formula. It's a huge topic that almost deserves to be a session in itself.
We've got, you know, our out of district costs, and then we've got new legislation coming forward that possibly will add another year onto special education services for our older kids. So you're right, it's a huge topic.
I've been tentatively put this down for June 1st, which will be our next meeting after May 21. We can revise that, but I've been taking notes about these topics relative to June 1.
So, you know, had said earlier, I threw out maybe once we get the compendium of legislative requirements in schools, that we go through that, at least in the subcommittee, just to get some weighing of zeros, ones, and twos, or plus minus centrality to the adequacy cost of each of these items, so that we could, those that we have some uncertainty about, we actually spend some time on to determine if they should be within the structure or outside of, right? That, I mean, those are going to be the borderline questions that we need to answer.
Yeah, Jay, I think another thing too, because this can quickly turn into a, and I'll use the quote again, boil the ocean type of thing, which is just beyond anything any group of people is going to be able to accomplish in 7 or 8 months. But to identify specific assignments for our research partner on this, and so that way it's not so that we can have a lot of things moving forward in parallel, because I expect that the research contractor is really going to be spending a significant amount of time and effort supporting this work group.
So sorting through our questions about what's in and what's out is really going to be important. Is that where you were going with that thought?
Well, it's certainly important, but it's also something that I think we can get assistance from our research partner to do, and there may be other things too, whether it's COVID related. Obviously, we've got Jane's expertise with special education, but the research partner may be able to support that effort as well, to try to allow the work group to really move in the area of distilling policy, as opposed to analyzing. I mean, obviously analysis is part of it, but it's got to be an amount of work that is manageable for this work group, and actually for all of our work groups and the commission. So we need to know how best to utilize our research partner to support this.
Yep, and we'll need their timeframes too, because we'll be driven by where they need to go on disparities.
Mm-hmm.
So assuming we can get that representative at our May 18th meeting, let's spend at least a few minutes letting that representative know what we think we're going to need to know from them early on and what they can provide to us. So let's begin to create that work list with the consultant at the May 18th meeting. Carsey will go ahead and start this statutory sort of matrix that we've discussed earlier, but I expect they'll help us fill that out as well. And most importantly, they'll help us put that in national context.
Yes.
I should also point out too, point out's not the right word, but just remark that, again, when talking with people from other states that are either in the middle of these sorts of projects or have completed similar projects, that there's a lot of similarity to what we're doing. Having to get an enormous amount of work and obviously a very substantial amount of work done in a very, very compressed time frame. This is not an uncommon type of thing. And some of the questions Bruce and I asked the references went down the lines of, what would you do? What would you have done differently? What are the things to look out for? And so, we learned a lot about the respondents, but we also, I think, learned a lot of hints in terms of, things that could make our jobs a little easier and as productive as possible. Is that fair, Bruce? Yeah.
I think we've covered our agenda. I know Bruce would like to have a overall time schedule for us. I think that's, Bruce, that's going to be a tough thing for our group to end on today, but I know you want to drive to that soon, and if we can do that in conjunction with the timetable from the consultant that's selected, it probably will be the most efficient way to give us some insight where we need to be at what calendar date.
No, I think we made a start on that, and just having this prospective calendar going out a few weeks for our work group meetings with identified topics within each one, that begins to build that timeline, and then sort of the benchmarks about by when we're going to have completed, our statutory review, the cost updates, gathering information from folks who know what it currently goes in the basket. So I think we've made a start on that, benchmarks and timeline for sure.
Bill?
Jay, on timeline, and I'm looking at Dave too as chair, one of a great exercise if you're walking into, let's say, a transaction, is you start at the end imagining what your work product is going to possibly look like, and then you back up from there to a realistic time frame. And I'm assuming our work product here is a report, and it has current law, it has reasons for change, it has proposal, it has transition rules, it has effective date. Or I leave that to Dave and Jay, Mel, the leadership of this commission, and Bruce, to think about what the outcome is, and then back up from there. I think that if I'm representing a client in an M&A deal like General Mills or something, I say, let's start at the end and let's back up from there. What does our closing list look like? And I think that's a good exercise. Maybe Bruce Carsey can kind of think through what does, we're not drafting any of the report yet, but what are the outline for the report is a great way to start backing up and driving presentations. Thanks.
That's good. Thanks.
Our thinking is we're on the same page as you. Absolutely.
All right. With a few minutes to spare, I think we've covered the agenda. I think we've done a good job, and we've got some goals for and homework assignments that we'll capture. Jordan, thank you for getting us together today, and I'm sure we'll compare notes from today's meeting and get them out to the rest of the group.
I took notes here, and so I'll be sending those out today to everybody.
Great.
Thank you.
All right.
Great.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Jay. Next is 1 o'clock is public engagement.
All right.
Correct.
See you again. See some of you.
Same login.
Same login. Got it.
Same login. Right.
Bye.
All right.
Bye, everybody.
See you in a while. Thanks.